The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, Lady Miriam of House Asheville was already being packed like furniture. No consultation, no ceremony. Lord Caius, the king's chief adviser, had simply walked into the Eastern Hall, where three noble daughters sat embroidering, and said, "The North Duke requires a court liaison. We'll send the Asheville girl." He hadn't even looked at her when he said it. He'd been looking at his rings. The other two girls, Seraphina of House Dorn and the elder Priscilla Vale, had laughed. Not loudly. Noble women didn't laugh loudly. They laughed in the precise, controlled way of people who want you to know they're laughing without being caught doing it. A breath through the nose, a shared glance. Seraphina had pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling. And that was enough. Miriam had said nothing. She folded her embroidery, set it on the chair, stood, curtsied to Caius, who still wasn't looking at her, and walked out. That was the last anyone in the king's court saw of her for 11 months. What the court knew about the North Duke could fill a very short book. His name was Ezra. Duke Ezra Malachi Voss, Lord of the Northern Reaches, Warden of the Asheville Pass, and a dozen other titles that nobody used because nobody wanted to say his name more than once. He was 34. He had never married. He had refused 3 royal match proposals, each refusal delivered in fewer words than the last, until the third one came back as a single sentence. "I do not require a wife. I require the border taxes renegotiated." He had not visited the capital in 6 years. He had, in those 6 years, tripled the military output of the Northern Territories, rerouted 2 trade roads without royal approval, and executed a baron for price manipulation with such swift and documented precision that even the king's own judges had found nothing to contest. The man was not cruel. That was the unsettling part. He was simply exact. The court feared him the way people fear a mechanism they don't understand, not because it threatens them directly, but because it operates on rules they can't read. Sending Miriam was, in the minds of Lord Caius and his circle, a perfectly calculated insult. Not to Ezra, they weren't brave enough for that. To her. She was the orphan ward of a minor house, kept at court more out of bureaucratic inertia than any genuine status. Her bloodline was recorded, technically noble, but her mother had been a merchant's daughter from the river districts, and everyone knew it. The court had never let her forget it. So yes, send her north. Let the cold duke deal with the court's cast-off. If he dismissed her, it was no loss. If he was rude to her, well, she should have been born better. What Lord Caius did not know, what none of them knew, was that Ezra Voss had been looking for Miriam of House Asheville for 4 years. The observer who would later record these events was a man named Tobias, a traveling record-keeper employed by the Northern Reaches to document territorial proceedings. He was not important. He was, by his own admission in the margins of his journals, a man of extraordinary unremarkability, which made him exceptional at watching things. He was present at the gate of Voss Keep when the carriage arrived. It was late afternoon, the sky the particular shade of iron gray that the North wore for most of the year, and the carriage was badly road-worn, one wheel repaired with what appeared to be a length of fence post. Tobias noted this. He noted the 2 guards who rode alongside it, both clearly court-assigned and both clearly miserable. He noted the steward, old Barnabas, standing at the keep's entrance with the patient expression of a man who had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. What Tobias did not expect was the woman who stepped out of the carriage. She was not what he'd anticipated. The court liaison position, in his experience, usually produced someone decorative and ineffectual, someone sent to observe and report back without disturbing anything. This woman stepped out of the carriage and immediately looked up at the keep's outer wall, not at the architecture, at the defensive positioning of the archer slits. She looked at them the way someone looks at a problem they're already solving. She was road dusty. Her traveling cloak had a tear at the left hem. She carried her own satchel. Barnabas descended the steps. "My lady, welcome to Voss Keep. I am Barnabas, head steward, 22 years of service." She said it without arrogance. "Just information. Is the Duke available?" Barnabas paused. A small pause, but Tobias caught it. "His Grace is concluding a military review. He will receive you at dinner." "I'd prefer now." Another pause. "Longer." "My lady, His Grace's schedule." "Tell him," she said. and she looked at Barnabas directly, "that the court has sent someone who has read all 14 of his border renegotiation proposals, every draft, including the ones that were never submitted." She let that sit. "He'll want to know that." Barnabas looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the careful deliberateness of a man recalibrating, he turned and went back up the steps without another word. Tobias wrote in his margin, "She knows something she shouldn't." Ezra Voss did not come to dinner. He came within 8 minutes of Barnabas delivering the message, still in his military review clothes, a sheaf of documents under one arm. Tobias heard him before he saw him, boots on stone, fast, not running, but close. And then the door to the reception hall opened, and the North Duke walked in. Tobias had expected someone larger. Ezra was tall, yes, and the way he moved suggested someone who had never once questioned whether a room would accommodate him. But it was his face that stopped the room. Not handsome in the soft capital way. Precise, angular, a jaw that looked like a decision. His dark hair was still damp from the review field, and he hadn't smoothed it, and he clearly did not care. He stopped when he saw her. Not a dramatic stop, not a stumble, a halt, the kind that comes from a body receiving information that the mind hasn't processed yet. 3 seconds, maybe 4. His eyes moved across her face with an intensity that Tobias, from his position near the far wall, found almost uncomfortable to witness. Then, "Leave us," addressed to everyone in the room. His staff moved immediately. The 2 court guards looked at each other. "Your Grace, our orders are to leave." They left. Tobias, tucked behind a document shelf in his professional capacity, did not leave. This was, in his personal defense, a lapse in ethics he would spend considerable time justifying to himself later. In the moment, he simply did not move. Ezra crossed the room in 7 strides. He stopped 2 feet from her. The documents were still under his arm. He was looking at her face with the same expression a man wears when he's reading a map and finally recognizes the terrain. "You read the unsubmitted drafts," he said. "Yes. Those documents don't exist. Not officially. I know." "How?" It wasn't a question. Not entirely. It was the sound of someone demanding an accounting. She looked at him steadily. There was something in her stillness. Tobias noted it, underlined it twice. That was not the stillness of composure. It was the stillness of someone who had rehearsed this moment so many times that the emotion had worn smooth. "Because I wrote them," she said. "The 3rd draft, the 6th, and the 9th, which you rewrote so heavily I almost didn't recognize it, but the framework for the tariff section was mine." The room was very quiet. Ezra's expression did not collapse. It didn't crumble into shock the way a lesser person's might. It simply changed. Something behind his eyes shifted, reconfigured, and the document sheaf slipped from under his arm and hit the floor, and he didn't look at it. "Miriam," he said. The word came out differently than anything else he'd said. Not a title, not a formality, a name he'd been holding in his mouth for a long time. "Hello, Ezra." Here is what Tobias did not know yet, because no one had told him, and it would take him 3 more weeks of careful listening to piece it together. Ezra Voss and Miriam of House Asheville had corresponded for 6 years, not under their real names, not directly. The correspondence had begun as an accident, a misfiled administrative letter that had reached the wrong desk, been answered by the wrong person, and somehow produced a response so precise and well argued that Ezra had answered it back. The exchange had continued, monthly, then weekly, then sometimes daily, during the border crisis of the 4th year, when the letters had stopped being about policy entirely and become something else. He had called her by a scholar's alias. She had never corrected him, because she hadn't known he didn't know, because the alias had been assigned to her by the archive where she worked in secret, a small illegal arrangement she'd made with a northern trade scholar who'd recognized her mind and had no patience for the court's assessment of it. When the correspondence stopped, abruptly, 8 months ago, when the archive was raided and closed and everyone connected to it scattered, Ezra had spent 4 months trying to find her, quietly, through channels that wouldn't embarrass him and wouldn't endanger her. He had not found her. She had been 30 feet away from the king's court the entire time, embroidering in the eastern hall, and now Lord Caius, in his infinite cleverness, had sent her north as an afterthought, as a joke, as proof of what he thought she was worth. Tobias would later write, in the final volume of his Northern Reaches record, "I have documented many transfers of power, treaties, battles, the quiet violence of inheritance. But I have never seen anything quite like what I witnessed in that reception hall. The moment a man who controls 300 miles of the kingdom's most strategic border realized that the woman the capital had sent him as an insult was the only person in 6 years who had understood what he was trying to build. He didn't soften. That is what I want to make clear. Ezra Voss did not become gentle. He became something more dangerous than he had been before. He became decided. Dinner did not happen that evening. Not formally. What happened instead? Ezra retrieved the fallen documents. He spread them on the long table. Miriam set down her satchel, removed her own papers, travel-worn, annotated in 3 colors, and placed them alongside his. They stood at opposite ends of the table and began. Tobias, from his shelf corner, watched 2 people who had built something enormous together in the dark finally stand in the same room with it. They argued within 20 minutes. Not badly. Productively, the way people argue when they both know what they're talking about and disagree about method, not intent. Ezra pointed at something and said it was wrong. Miriam said it wasn't wrong. It was ahead of what he'd been willing to see yet. Ezra was quiet for a moment, and then said she might be right, and moved on without fanfare. And Tobias thought, I have never once seen him concede anything to anyone. By the time the candles burned low, they had restructured the 9th proposal entirely. Neither of them had eaten. Neither of them seemed to notice. Word traveled the way. Word always travels in a keep. Sideways, through servants, in pieces. By the 3rd morning, Voss Keep knew that the court liaison had not been installed in the guest quarters as expected, but in the archive wing, at her own request, where she had apparently spent her first full night reading 12 years of Northern Territorial records and left margin notes in 4 of them. Barnabas had found the notes at dawn. He'd stood in the archive doorway for a long moment, reading one, and then gone directly to find Ezra. Tobias had been in the corridor. He'd seen Barnabas's face. It was the face of a man who had just understood something important. The 2 court guards, meanwhile, had sent a preliminary report back to the capital. Tobias knew this because he overheard them composing it near the stables, speaking with the comfortable indiscretion of men who assumed no one credible was listening. Their report was brief and self-congratulatory. The liaison had been delivered. The Duke had received her without incident. No diplomatic friction to note. They expected to return to the capital within the fortnight. They had no idea what they'd brought here. Neither did Lord Caius, who received their report 6 days later, read it in under a minute, and returned to his rings. On the 5th day, Ezra called a formal session. This was unusual. Formal sessions at Voss Keep were rare. Ezra preferred working meetings, documents on tables, sleeves rolled, no ceremony. A formal session meant chairs arranged, staff present, records taken. It meant something was being made official. Tobias arrived early and took his position at the recorder's desk. The room filled. Ezra's military commander, a broad man named General Phineas, took his seat with the careful expression of someone who had been briefed but was reserving judgment. The treasury head, a thin woman named Elspeth, arrived with 3 ledgers and set them down with precise, controlled force that suggested she had opinions she was not yet voicing. 2 regional wardens, the head of Northern Trade, a cartographer. They were all looking at the empty chair to Ezra's left. Miriam came in last. She was still road travel thin. The Norse kitchen had only had 5 days to work on that. And she walked to the chair without hesitation and sat and placed her documents on the table and looked at the room. The room looked back. General Phineas's eyes moved to Ezra. The question on his face was clear. Who is this woman, and why is she sitting there? Ezra didn't answer the unasked question. He opened the session. The 9th border renegotiation proposal, he said, has been revised. The revision addresses the structural failures in the tariff framework that made the previous 8 proposals unacceptable to the Crown's eastern faction. He paused. Lady Miriam will present the framework. Silence. Not hostile silence. Stunned silence. The specific silence of a room full of experienced, capable people who have been blindsided by a variable they weren't given. Miriam stood. She did not introduce herself. She did not explain her credentials or offer context for her presence. She simply began, and within 4 sentences, Tobias watched General Phineas's skepticism undergo a visible, involuntary revision. By the time she reached the tariff recalculation, Elspeth had opened all 3 ledgers and was cross-referencing in real time. The cartographer had leaned forward so far he was nearly out of his chair. She spoke for 40 minutes. She took 2 questions, answered both with the precision of someone who had not only anticipated them, but had already found the problems with 3 possible counterarguments. When she sat, the room was a different room than it had been when she'd stood. Phineas looked at Ezra. Ezra looked back. Something passed between them, the shorthand of men who have worked together for years, and Phineas gave a single small nod. Not approval exactly. Acknowledgement, the kind that cost something from a man like that. "Where?" said Elspeth, in the tone of someone who has decided to ask the inconvenient question that the room is avoiding. "Has she been?" Ezra said. "She was at the Capitol." "And before that?" "Working." Elspeth looked at Miriam. Miriam looked back and did not offer more than she'd been asked for. Elspeth made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more like the noise of someone revising a very long-held assumption, and returned to her ledgers. Tobias wrote, "They don't know yet. None of them know what she is to him. They think this is a political maneuver. They are wrong, but they don't have the information to know they're wrong. He is watching her in a way that a man only watches something he has been afraid of losing." The court guards left on the 9th day, which was earlier than planned. Tobias learned later that Ezra had smoothly, politely, and completely fabricated a bureaucratic reason for their early departure that the guards hadn't thought to question. The report they carried back to the Capitol was functionally useless, courteous, vague, and full of the kind of non-information that Lord Caius would read as confirmation that nothing of interest was happening. Nothing of interest. Tobias almost wrote something sharp in his margin about that. He restrained himself. What was actually happening? The 9th proposal had been finalized. Not drafted, finalized. In 9 days, a document that had failed in 8 previous iterations over 4 years had been completed. Ezra's people knew it. The energy in the keep had changed in the specific way that a place changes when it's on the edge of something it's been working toward for a very long time. But the proposal wasn't the thing. Tobias understood that. The proposal was the surface. The real thing was that the hidden correspondence had built an architecture between these 2 people that neither of them had ever been able to build with anyone else, and now they were in the same physical space, and the architecture was becoming visible. It was visible in how Ezra's staff moved around her, how Barnabas had, without any apparent directive, begun briefing her alongside Ezra each morning, how General Phineas, who was famously immovable on matters of territorial security, had spent 2 hours revising his fortification assessment after one conversation with her, and had emerged from that conversation looking both irritated and convinced. It was visible in how Ezra's daily schedule, which had run on machine-like predictability for 6 years, had quietly reorganized itself around when she was available. The court had sent her here as an afterthought. She was dismantling everything they thought the North was and rebuilding it stronger, and they had no idea. On the 14th day, a second letter arrived from the Capitol. Tobias saw Ezra read it. He was at his desk, morning light coming in hard from the east window, and his face was perfectly controlled throughout, right until the end, when something moved across it that was not controlled at all. He read the final paragraph twice. Then he set the letter down with very particular care, the way a person sets something down when the alternative is to do something else with it. He summoned Miriam. She came in already knowing, from the look on Barnabas's face when he'd fetched her, that something had shifted. She sat across from Ezra. He slid the letter across the desk. Tobias, at the recorder station in the corner, went very still. She read it. Her face, unlike Ezra's, showed it immediately, a tightening around the eyes, a single breath that was slightly too controlled. Then nothing. She set the letter down. "They want me back," she said. "Caius says the liaison assignment has concluded." Ezra's voice was level. "He's citing a court administrative restructuring. He wants you returned within the week." Returned. The word was flat. "With a full report on northern proceedings." A pause. "He expects the report to be minimal. He's already decided nothing happened here worth noting." Miriam was quiet. Tobias watched her look at the letter, and then at the window, and then at the surface of the desk. Not aimlessly, but the way someone looks at things when they're thinking very fast and need their eyes to be somewhere neutral. "He's going to bury the proposal," she said. "It wasn't a question. If you go back, yes. And if I don't, then you're in defiance of a court directive." Ezra's eyes were on her. "That has consequences." For me? Yes. She looked at him. He looked at her. And there it was, the weight of 6 years of correspondence, all that construction in the dark pressing against the present moment. Tobias felt it from across the room. He did not write anything. His pen was still, "I've been in defiance of something or other since I was 16, Miriam said finally. I learned to manage it. Ezra was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm going to the capital, she went still. Ezra, the proposal requires formal presentation to the king, not through Caius, directly. His voice had gone to that register, the one Tobias had heard him use once before when he told a baron that the execution order had been signed. Not loud, not aggressive, final. I have not exercised my right of direct royal address in 6 years. It is past time. They will make it about me, Miriam said. The moment you walk in there with this proposal and with me beside you, they will make it about my bloodline and my station and every other thing they've used to. I know. And you want to do it anyway? I want to do it correctly? He stood. He was already thinking forward, the way he always did. 3 steps ahead and moving. If the proposal reaches the king through proper channels, without Caius filtering it first, it stands on its own. They can argue the politics all they want. The numbers don't bend. And me? He picked up the letter. He looked at it once more, then set it aside with the deliberate motion of something being classified as irrelevant. You are the co-author of the most significant border renegotiation in 40 years. What they call you in the Eastern Hall doesn't change what you built. Tobias finally wrote something. A single line. He's known the whole time that she was more than they said she was. He just didn't know it was her. They rode to the capital in 11 days. Tobias rode with the party because it was his professional obligation, and because nothing in his long career of watching things had prepared him for what he believed was about to happen. The capital received him the way the capital receives things it doesn't understand, with a surface of courtesy stretched thin over considerable alarm. Word had gone ahead. It always did. The North Duke was coming, personally, with documentation. Lord Caius met them in the outer receiving hall, and to his credit, he recovered from the sight of Miriam quickly. Within a second and a half, his expression had moved from shock to the careful blankness of a man recalculating. He looked at her the way he might look at a piece of furniture that had inexplicably rearranged itself. Lady Miriam, he said, we had expected your return some days ago. She was working, said Ezra, simply. The same word he'd used with Elspeth. Caius looked at Ezra. He was not a stupid man. Tobias had always granted him that. He could see the shape of something here, even if he didn't have the specific information. Your Grace, the court appreciates the personal attention, but the proposal can certainly be reviewed through standard. I will address the king tomorrow morning, Ezra said. I have already sent word. His Majesty has confirmed the appointment. Caius went still. There it was, the move that couldn't be reversed. Ezra had gone over his head cleanly, and the confirmation meant the king's own curiosity had been engaged. And everyone in that hall understood that Caius could not now redirect this without it looking like obstruction. Of course, Caius said. I'll arrange. It's arranged, Ezra said, and walked past him. Miriam followed. She did not look at Caius. She did not look at Seraphina, who was standing near the hall entrance, pale, her embroidery hoop hanging forgotten from one hand. She looked forward, and she walked forward, and her spine was very straight. Tobias watched Caius turn and stare after them, watched the calculation happening behind his eyes, watched the moment when the calculation reached its conclusion, and Caius understood, possibly for the first time, that he had made a mistake. Not a recoverable mistake. The other kind. The royal address lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. Tobias was in the recorder's position, and he documented everything. And he will not reproduce it in detail here because the detail is in the official record, and the official record is thorough. What he will note, what the official record does not capture, is the moment midway through when Ezra laid the proposal's framework before the king, and the king asked who had authored the tariff section, because it was unlike anything his advisors had produced. Ezra said her name, her full name, her title, her co-authorship stated plainly and without qualification before the throne, and then he said, She has been at your court for 7 years, Your Majesty. You may want to consider how your court has been using that. The room was very quiet. Tobias looked at Caius. Caius was looking at nothing in particular. The expression on his face was one Tobias had never seen there before. Something had gone out of it. The certainty, perhaps. The comfortable, unexamined certainty of a man who had always known what things were worth. Miriam stood beside the North Duke and said nothing. She didn't need to. The proposal was on the table. Her name was on it. 6 years of work was sitting in front of the king of the realm, and there was not a single word in it that could be argued against, because she had already found every argument and answered it before anyone else knew to ask. The proposal was approved before the session closed. Tobias finished his record that evening in his room at the Capitol Inn. He wrote for a long time. He wrote about the proposal and its implications and the formal record of the address. Then he set down the official account and wrote one more paragraph in his private margin. Lord Caius sent her north as a joke, as proof of what a low-born woman was worth in the estimation of men who have decided how worth is measured. He sent her to the most feared duke in the kingdom because he thought it would diminish her and inconvenience Ezra and cost nothing. He didn't know that she had spent 6 years building Ezra's most important work with him, word by word, across a correspondence that no one was supposed to see. He didn't know that Ezra had been looking for her. He didn't know that the thing Ezra Voss, who fears nothing and needs nothing, could not replace or reconstruct or find anywhere else, was the mind of the woman he'd sent away as an insult. He sent her directly to the one place in the kingdom where her value was already known. He handed Ezra the thing Ezra had been trying to find for 8 months, and the proposal was approved. And her name is in the official record of the throne room, permanent and unremovable. And Caius will spend the rest of his career navigating around a woman he put on a carriage with a torn hem and an afterthought. I have recorded many transfers of power. I have never seen one delivered so cleanly by the people who intended the opposite. The last thing Tobias witnessed, the thing he did not put in any record, official or otherwise, because some things are not for records, was this. The evening after the royal address, in the corridor outside the throne room, Miriam stopped walking. Ezra was 3 steps ahead before he noticed. He turned. She was standing very still, and the composure that had held through 14 days at the keep and 11 days of travel and 1 hour and 40 minutes before the throne had finally, just slightly, come apart at the edges. Not a collapse, a single crack. Her hand was at her side, and it was not quite steady. Ezra came back. He said nothing. He looked at her face with that same expression Tobias had first seen in the reception hall, the one that wasn't soft, exactly, but was something that lived in the same country as soft. He reached out and straightened the collar of her travel cloak. One small adjustment, then he dropped his hand. "The cartographer," he said, "wants to start on the boundary mapping next week. He'll need your framework notes." She looked at him. Something moved through her expression and settled. "He'll have them," she said. They walked on. Tobias stood in the corridor alone and did not write anything for a long time. Then he wrote, decided, just as I said.